He was once the king of energy, Winston Merrick, the billionaire mogul who ruled boardrooms and brokered power with the flick of a pen. But now, in the thick of a Colorado winter, the man who once lit up cities hides alone in a mountaintop fortress, shattered by the death of his wife and paralyzed by a pride that refused to die with her. This is the story of how a man who believed love was a transaction met a woman who refused to be bought, and how one poem, read in secret, shook the last walls of his icy empire. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget, sit back and enjoy the story. Winston Merrick had not spoken to anyone in person for more than 2 months before he hired Grace Miller, 68, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and carved from the cold steel of capitalism. He lived alone in a sprawling glass and stone chalet overlooking the pine-covered valleys of Aspen. He wasn't hiding, at least not in the way cowards do. He called it retirement, but to anyone paying attention, it was exile. An exile wrapped in cashmere blankets, poured into crystal glasses, and paced by the soft clicking of Italian leather shoes on hardwood floors when his assistant in Denver called to say that the staff refused to come up the mountain for the season. Winston barely blinked. "Send someone quiet," he said. "No chatter. I don't need a friend. I need a functioning human being." Grace arrived 2 days later in a dented Subaru, wearing a coat too thin for the snow and boots with cracked soles. She was 32, but looked older not from time, but from memory. She had the kind of face that avoided cameras and the kind of presence that made rooms feel emptier. When she walked in, she didn't ask questions, didn't smile much, and didn't explain the burn marks on her left wrist. She accepted the job with a nod, took the keys to the service quarters behind the wine cellar, and disappeared like she'd always belonged to the background. For Winston, she was furniture, useful, invisible. He barked requests like commands. Laundry by 9, kitchen cleared by noon, guest rooms dusted twice a week in case someone from the board decided to drop by, which no one ever did anymore. He never looked her in the eyes. If he passed her in the hallway, he'd talk over her, not to her. Grace took it all in silence. Not submission, just silence. She moved through the house like she was walking through someone else's dream. But every night, in the cramped attic room above the garage, she wrote long, aching lines that crawled out of her like whispers too afraid to become screams. Poetry, scrawled on napkins, grocery receipts, the backs of unpaid bills. It was how she survived. It was late January when Winston heard her voice for the first time, not the yes, sir, or right away he was used to, but her voice alone, reciting something that made the air stand still. He had gone upstairs to retrieve a box of old journals. The attic door was cracked, and through it, he saw her sitting cross-legged on an old rug, reading to no one. "You don't even flinch when you break what you can't feel," she said, her voice low, trembling but steady. "You say pain is weakness, but yours is pride, and it's louder." Winston stepped in without knocking. "That's an awful lot of drama for someone whose hands smell like bleach and potatoes," he said, smirking. Grace didn't look up. She simply closed the notebook and stood. He followed her with his eyes. Curious now. "Write something about me," he said, casually, like he was ordering dessert. "I'll pay you $1,000. Make it honest, or whatever you think that means." She paused, gave a nod that felt like a challenge, and walked away. 3 days later, she slid an envelope under his study door. He read it after lunch, whiskey in hand, expecting either flattery or a childish attempt at revenge. What he got instead was a slow, brutal dismantling of his very essence, each line cut like a scalpel, not cruel, not angry, just true. You mistake silence for control. You confuse wealth with worth. You think hiding is winning, but you're just alone in a castle built on echoes. He laughed out loud, but it sounded hollow. Later that night, he posted the poem on his private social media, captioned, "Poetry from the help worth a chuckle." What followed wasn't laughter. It was fire. Comments flooded in, not mocking, but moved. "This is the most honest thing I've read this year. Who wrote this? I want more." This hit me like a confession. Winston watched the numbers climb. 10,000 views, then 100, then 1,000,000. He refreshed the page every hour, unnerved. He had controlled narratives his whole life, shaped markets with press releases and silenced scandals with money. But this he couldn't control. This woman he hadn't even looked in the eye had said more about him in 20 lines than he'd said about himself in a lifetime. He called Grace into the study. She entered with her hands behind her back, eyes lowered. "It went viral," he said. "People think it's deep. They think it's you. You realize they're making you the voice of something human." She didn't reply. He wanted her to be excited, or scared, or at least surprised. She wasn't. She just waited. "Well," he said finally, waving her off. "Congratulations, I guess. Your 15 minutes are ticking." She left quietly, but Winston didn't sleep that night. He kept hearing the lines, not the words, the truths. He poured another drink, then another, staring out at the snow, wondering how someone like her could see through someone like him. And worse, why it mattered. The poem had gone further than Winston ever imagined, shared by authors, quoted by politicians, dissected by commentators who didn't even know who had written it. And yet, inside the grand walls of the Aspen estate, the one who had bared her soul through ink and silence remained untouched by the storm she had caused. Grace continued cleaning silverware, scrubbing stone floors, preparing the house as if the world hadn't decided to make her voice a mirror. Winston watched her now with a strange unease, no longer seeing a nameless housekeeper, but someone whose truth had humiliated him without malice. He couldn't decide if he was impressed or threatened. The poem was elegant, yes, but also invasive. It had pried open corners of his past he didn't speak about, couldn't defend, and hadn't prepared to see exposed. He called a friend from his old media circle, a retired editor. "You read the poem I posted?" Winston asked, casually. Sipping coffee, the internet's eating it up. The editor didn't laugh. "You didn't write that," he said. "It's too human, too careful. Whoever did, she's not just a poet, Winston. She's dangerous. People don't cry because of rhyme. They cry because it hurts, right? Winston ended the call without saying goodbye. That night, he opened his laptop and typed her name into a search engine for the first time. Grace Miller. Nothing. No history. No photos. Just a LinkedIn profile with 3 vague jobs and no endorsements. She was a ghost. That, more than anything, began to gnaw at him. Over the following days, he tried small talk, like a child poking a lion with a stick. "How long have you been writing?" he asked one morning. Unannounced in the kitchen, Grace looked up briefly, then returned to her task. "Since I could hold a pencil," she said, polite but distant. "So, not long ago then," he replied with a smirk. But it didn't land. She left without another word. Something about her composure made him itch. Winston was used to resistance, angry, proud, vocal. But this woman gave him nothing. Not hate, not fear, not reverence. Just silence that felt like a judgment. On Friday night, he hosted a small gathering of old friends, former investors, the kind of people who liked to drink scotch and pretend the world still needed them. Grace was tasked with serving hors d'oeuvres and keeping the fireplace fed. At one point, a guest, slightly drunk and trying to flirt, asked her if she was the poet. The room laughed. Winston didn't. He watched her nod once and step away, graceful even in dismissal. Later, one of the wives commented, "She's got eyes like someone who's seen something awful and learned to live with it." The remark stayed with him all night. 2 days later, a package arrived addressed to Winston. No sender. Inside was a book, an old legal compendium, tagged with sticky notes. Tucked in the first page was a photocopy of an article, "Texas Foster Home Scandal, Missing Funds, and Misplaced Teens." Underlined in red was a name, Grace Eleanor Marsh. His hands stiffened. Marsh, not Miller. He read through the article, slowly realizing what it meant. Grace wasn't just mysterious, she was wanted. A warrant issued for theft, still active. He stood motionless for a long time, staring at the walls of his fortress. It would be easy, he thought. One call, one correction, one clean break from the viral mess now threatening his image. She was folding sheets when he found her. "Grace," he said, voice lower than usual. "Is Grace even your name?" She paused, looked at him not like someone caught, but like someone already condemned. "It's one of them," she said softly, but not the first. He didn't ask more. He simply said, "You need to leave. Tonight." She nodded once, walked past him, and disappeared down the corridor. There were no tears, no begging, no angry words, just the sound of a suitcase being dragged across stone, the click of the service door unlocking, and then silence. He watched from his office window as she walked out through the snow. No car waiting, no plan visible. Her coat was still too thin. She carried only a duffel bag and a small blue notebook clutched to her chest. He could have called her back, could have asked what the real story was. But he didn't. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he wasn't ready to admit that somewhere between curiosity and condescension, he had started to care. 3 days passed. Then a headline broke across national news. Aspen poet identified as fugitive from Texas. Case, her mugshot, years old and grainy, was everywhere. The poem was quoted beside it now not as art, but as irony. The same voices that once hailed her now called her a fraud, a thief, a liar. Winston's inbox exploded with messages, some demanding answers, others warning him to distance himself, and he did. When asked for comment, he said only, "I had no knowledge of her past." It was technically true, but it tasted like cowardice still. Something about her departure didn't sit right. Why hadn't she defended herself? Why hadn't she denied it? Most guilty people try to hide. She had just walked away. He tried to dismiss the thought, tried to return to routine. But every room in the house felt empty now, every silence too loud. One night, he opened her old quarters. The bed was neatly made. On the dresser, a small scrap of paper remained. On it, a single line written in familiar ink. "Silence is the last truth we tell." That was the moment the story stopped being a performance. For Winston, it became personal. Not because he missed her, not because of guilt, but because he realized something terrifying. He had built his entire life on the belief that people were either assets or threats, and Grace had been neither. She had been a mirror, and he had shattered it. Grace had barely made it to Glenwood Springs when the past caught up with her. At a gas station off the interstate, a patrol car pulled in silently behind her. There was no warning, no time to run. The officer approached with calm authority, asked her name, and she didn't lie. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe she knew the running had ended the moment she let Winston read her words. Within minutes, she was in cuffs, seated in the back of the cruiser, staring out at the falling snow, the mountains fading behind her. There were no cries of injustice, no dramatic resistance, just the hollow weight of inevitability pressing down. As the lights of the jail came into view, the charges read like an echo from another life: theft of state property, obstruction, unlawful disappearance. Old words, dusted off by lazy hands. News of her arrest spread fast. The same outlets that had elevated her poetry now smeared her face across screens, eager to pivot. Viral poet turns out to be fugitive. From verse to vice, each headline chipped away at the mystique they had once adored. But somewhere in a modest house outside Boulder, an elderly woman named Sarah Collins watched the coverage and didn't flinch. She recognized the name of the foster home mentioned, St. Augustine's. She remembered the case. Decades ago, she'd worked as a public defender and fought similar charges against other children from the same place. The accusations never stuck, but this one had. Sarah had always felt uneasy about it. Within 48 hours, Sarah was on the phone requesting court transcripts, archived files, and internal audits. Most people had forgotten. She hadn't. As she read through yellowed papers, she saw the gaps: mismatched dates, missing testimonies, a disappearance treated as a confession. Grace, or rather Grace Eleanor Marsh, had vanished at 17 after a violent altercation between another girl and a house manager. That girl had gone missing too, but no one searched for her. They searched for Grace. Because she had been the one who spoke up, who accused the wrong man and then disappeared. The theft charge had always felt like a punishment for surviving. Back in her holding cell, Grace said little. Her court-appointed lawyer tried to pry for a story. Any defense, she refused. The truth doesn't fit in a statement, she said quietly, and I'm tired of folding it to make it palatable. The public lost interest quickly. They wanted spectacle, not silence. Offers from publishers, agents, and reporters were left unanswered. When a judge finally set a court date, it came with a sense of obligation, not urgency. But Sarah showed up. She brought 3 folders, one sealed envelope, and an old voice recorder dot in the courtroom. Grace sat alone at the defense table. No family, no friends, no audience beyond reporters and the board. But when Sarah rose to speak, the room shifted. Her voice was slow but certain. She detailed the abuse at the foster home, the corruption that had buried testimonies, the documents she had unearthed showing a pattern of falsified records. She submitted a sworn statement from a retired counselor who confirmed that Grace had been set up as a scapegoat. Her escape had never been about guilt, it had been survival. The judge listened, silent and still. Before asking Grace if she had anything to say, she stood, hands folded in front of her, and looked straight ahead. There are stories that don't need to be rewritten, she said. They need to be released. That was all. No tears, no apologies, no bitterness, just a line that landed like a verdict. The judge exhaled, glanced over the papers again, and then read aloud the ruling. All charges dismissed. Case closed. Grace was free. But freedom came with shadows. She declined interviews, refused royalties, and vanished again, this time by choice. She moved into a small cottage outside Portland, Oregon, and began teaching poetry workshops at a juvenile detention center. She never mentioned her past. To her students, she was just Miss G, the quiet lady with a soft voice and sharp eyes. But something about her presence made even the roughest boys lean in when she spoke. Meanwhile, Winston sat alone in his Aspen home, now quieter than ever. His public image had taken a hit not because of Grace's arrest, but because of his response. People had seen the way he dismissed her, then distanced himself when things got hard. For a man who once controlled perception with surgical precision, the collapse was brutal. Sponsors withdrew. Boards he once led replaced him quietly. His name stopped appearing on event lists. He tried to write a response to the media, but every draft rang hollow. Nothing he wrote felt real. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer of unopened mail, he found the original poem Grace had written. It was tucked inside an envelope with a sticky note that simply read, "You laughed, but I meant every word." He sat down and read it again, this time slowly, letting each phrase settle. For the first time, he saw himself in it, not the titan of industry, not the tragic widower, but the man behind, both frightened, angry, and incapable of recognizing kindness unless it came with a price tag. He poured a drink and let the poem sit on his chest, feeling its weight in a way no stock report ever had. That night, he dreamed of her voice. Not her face, her voice, steady, unflinching. with the rhythm of someone who had bled quietly for years and learned how to speak without breaking. He woke up to snow outside, thick and blinding. He walked to the window and stood there for a long time. He didn't know where she was. He didn't expect to see her again. But the silence she left behind was louder than any apology he might have offered. By the time the snow began to melt along the edges of the Rockies, the world had already moved on. News cycles turned their focus to fresher scandals and louder voices, leaving Grace's name buried under forgotten headlines and broken links. But not everyone forgot Sarah Collins, the retired attorney who had dismantled the case against Grace, stayed quietly in touch with legal advocates in Colorado and Texas, ensuring the files stayed closed for good. Grace never contacted her, never sent thanks, but Sarah didn't expect that. Some debts are paid through silence, and some wounds close without ceremony. Grace had returned to her new life. With precision teaching, writing in the margins, walking among those who carried shadows like her own. She didn't need attention. She needed air. And for the first time in years, she had it. Winston, however, was unraveling. The cracks had been invisible at first missed calls. Small financial shifts, invitations quietly withdrawn. But over the months that followed Grace's departure and exoneration, those cracks widened into fractures. His name, once a fixture on every philanthropic board, was now associated with cowardice and coldness. He wasn't accused of any crime. He didn't need to be. People simply stopped answering. He noticed when his longtime CFO took a sudden sabbatical and didn't return. When one of his major real estate holdings in Chicago fell through due to ethical reassessment, he tried to blame the market, but it didn't stick. The truth was simpler. Winston had become a liability. And in the world of corporate loyalty, that was worse than being an enemy. He poured more time into controlling the narrative, hired a team of consultants, drafted op-eds, filmed a short documentary that framed him as a misunderstood innovator navigating grief. It flopped. Comments were brutal. He's trying to buy redemption. Let the poet speak again. One quote from Grace's poem appeared over and over. You mistake silence for control. He deleted his social media accounts. He couldn't control the echo anymore. And nothing he said carried the weight of her words. The house in Aspen, once a symbol of power, now felt like a mausoleum. Empty rooms, unread books, ghosts made of regret. One morning, while sifting through old receipts and forgotten legal letters, Winston found a small package wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside was the blue notebook. Her notebook. Not the one she carried around, but another, filled with unfinished poems and fragments scraps of memory written in cursive. That cut deeper than full sentences ever could. He flipped through it slowly, stopping at a page where the ink had smeared from what could have been water or tears. There was no note, no explanation, just a line scribbled across the inside cover. Not everything that bleeds needs to be saved. For the first time in decades, Winston sat still for hours. No phone, no scotch, no noise. Just the weight of paper and the sound of everything he had missed. He remembered her walking out of the house, suitcase in hand, back straight, never. Looking back, he had thought she was weak, but now, all these months later, with everything crumbling around him, he began to see that she had been stronger than he ever was. She had survived, not by controlling others, but by refusing to be owned. That night, he stood in the kitchen where she once stood and whispered, "I never even asked who hurt you." Far away in Oregon, Grace continued her quiet work. She avoided interviews and cameras, even when a literary journal tried to connect her name to a best-selling poetry collection that had surfaced under a pseudonym. She denied everything, let the myth grow without her. Once a week, she took long walks by the river, always alone, always with her notebook. Her students, young men and women caught in the machinery of early punishment, clung to her sessions. Like lifelines, she didn't preach, she didn't rescue, she simply listened. And in that listening, they began to write, not polished, not pretty, but real. Words that didn't need approval. Only release. The manuscript of her work, compiled secretly by a former student, found its way to a publisher in Seattle who didn't care who she was, only that the words mattered. The title page read, "The Last Quiet," the author, anonymous. But the opening poem was unmistakably hers. There are people who only know how to love in silence. But some silences scream so loud, even gods mistake them for storms. It became a phenomenon again. Not viral, not flashy, but slow, like water carving canyons. Back in Aspen, Winston began writing not for the press, not for legacy, but by hand, in ink, alone. It started as an exercise. 1 page a day, then 2. Not about business or redemption, but about memories, a trip to Tuscany with his wife, the last phone call he never returned, the way Grace folded linens like they deserved respect. He didn't know where it was going. He didn't care. For the first time in his life, words felt like something earned, not bought. One evening, under the glow of the dying sun, he took one of those pages and wrote a letter. It wasn't addressed. It wasn't an apology. It was a confession, not of guilt, but of absence, of not being present, of watching people break and saying nothing. He didn't expect it to be read, but he folded it carefully, placed it between the pages of her notebook, and sealed it in an envelope. Weeks later, that envelope arrived at a publishing house in Portland with no signature. When Grace opened it, she read in silence, and then, quietly, folded the letter, tucked it into her old blue notebook, and placed it in a box in the attic. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. But she stood there for a long time, as if listening to something only she could hear. The winter returned to Aspen with a vengeance. Sharp winds carving through the pines like accusations left unsaid. Winston no longer entertained guests. The house, once pulsing with controlled chaos and catered elegance, now stood quiet and untouched. His assistant had resigned. His accountants no longer answered calls directly. Even the cleaning company left his messages unread. The fallout wasn't loud or scandalous, it was a silent severing of ties. Influence didn't vanish in a blaze. It eroded slowly, like trust. The phone rang less, invitations dried up. Investments began to slip beneath regulatory scrutiny. He wasn't bankrupt, but he was shrinking. And for a man who had once built empires with nothing but his name, irrelevance felt like a far crueler death. He walked through the halls more often now, not to admire the art, but to hear the echo of his own footsteps. Some rooms remained untouched since Grace left. He couldn't bring himself to enter the attic. The memory of her voice, reading verses to no one, clung to the rafters like dust he couldn't clean. He tried to fill the silence by writing, but every page turned into a plea for understanding he hadn't yet earned. One evening, drunk and exhausted, he opened his inbox and saw a message titled "Only Echo." It was a screenshot, a passage from her anonymously published book. No name, no message, just her words, sometimes the loudest sound in a man's. Life is the space he refuses to fill with truth. Winston stared at it for hours. That line was about him, unmistakably, undeniably him. And yet it wasn't cruel. It wasn't revenge. It was observation, unadorned and clean. He printed the screenshot and tacked it above his desk. From that moment, he stopped trying to reclaim the narrative. He let the story stand, let her version breathe. And in that surrender, something shifted. He didn't feel vindicated, but he felt visible. Maybe for the first time in his life, without controlling the frame. Elsewhere, far from snowy peaks and boardroom ghosts, Grace stood in front of a small audience in a library basement in Oregon, arms crossed, eyes focused not on the crowd, but on a teenage boy in the second row who had just read a poem about his mother's overdose. The room was silent, not out of pity, but respect. He looked down, ashamed of the rawness he'd shared, but Grace nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Truth," she said, "has a temperature, and yours is burning clean," the others scribbled that line down, not because she wanted them to, but because they knew it mattered. Grace wasn't a teacher in the traditional sense. She was more a witness, a steady mirror they could test their voices against. She hadn't seen the news about Winston in months, but his name resurfaced through whispers. A hedge fund collapsed, a tech merger failed, a charity pulled his name from its advisory board. But what truly caught her off guard was a phone call from Sarah Collins. The retired attorney had received a package from Winston's legal team documents, handwritten letters, and a request. He wanted Sarah to act as the custodian of something he called unfinished restitution. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them written to people Winston believed he had harmed. Not lawsuits, not scandals, just relationships he had neglected, severed, or monetized into silence. One was addressed to Grace. Sarah didn't read it. She forwarded it with care. When Grace opened the envelope, she expected deflection or some veiled form of penance. But the letter wasn't what she expected. It was messy, rambling in parts, filled with rewrites and cross-outs, but genuine. Winston hadn't written to apologize. He wrote to tell her what he had learned in her absence. "I used to believe power was safety," one line read. "But I was never safe. I was just unreachable. And then you who owed me nothing saw me anyway. And that scared me more than failure." There were no illusions in the pages, No redemption, arc pitched for sympathy. Just a man recounting moments he now recognized as pivotal, small things. The way she turned off light switches with care. The way she never interrupted, even when he deserved it. The silence she maintained not as submission, but as control. Grace folded the letter and placed it in the same attic box that now held his previous note. She didn't cry. She didn't forgive. Forgiveness wasn't required. But she walked to her desk, opened a new notebook, and for the first time in months, began to write not about pain, but about endurance. Not about survival, but presence. The pen moved with certainty, her hand steady. Each word fell with weight. Meanwhile, Winston stayed put. Aspen's winter closed in again, but he no longer watched the snowfall with bitterness. He began volunteering at a local hospice, quietly and without recognition. No speeches, no names, just small things driving patients, reading aloud when asked. The staff didn't know who he was, and he never told them. He didn't need to be seen anymore. He just needed to be their dot, and every night, as the wind howled, outside the great glass windows of his once proud home, Winston reread Grace's poem. The original one, the one that tore through his legacy and left him no place to hide. But instead of fearing it now, he began to read it aloud to himself, to the rooms, to the quiet, not as a wound, but as a tether, a thread that connected him, at last, to something real. Years had passed. The storm around the poem, the arrest, the revelations, they had all faded into the static of yesterday's headlines. The world had long since redirected its appetite to newer names, newer scandals, newer stories. But in a quiet Oregon town, Grace lived a different rhythm. The whispers of her identity still lingered, passed between bookstore clerks and local artists, but no one pressed her. The truth had turned into something sacred, something people were afraid to touch. She continued her quiet work, teaching poetry to young men on the edge of ruin and redemption. Her classes weren't about grammar or form, they were about endurance. The way a sentence could hold pain without flinching, the way a metaphor could become a lifeline. She never spoke of herself, but the students knew. Somehow, they all knew she had survived something deeper than any of them could articulate. Grace's book, The Last Quiet, continued to sell in steady waves. Literary circles praised its anonymity. Critics speculated on the author's past, but she never confirmed anything. She refused interviews, never attended readings. Even as copies reached shelves in London, Tokyo, and Buenos Aires, Grace remained an absence defined only by the words she left behind. Then one evening, at a small reading by another poet, something unexpected happened. A young woman stood up and recited a passage from Grace's poem, the one Winston had once posted as a joke. The room was still. Grace sat in the back, unrecognized. But when she heard her own line spoken through someone else's voice, strong, trembling, hopeful, she felt a quiet shiver run through her. She didn't stand. She didn't claim credit. She just listened, her eyes wet, a smile flickering for the first time in months. Winston, now well into his 70s, had become nearly unrecognizable from the man who once ruled with emails and equity stakes. His body was thinner, his gait slower, but his eyes had softened. The house in Aspen was still his, though stripped of its former opulence. No staff, no parties, no art dealers or hedge fund managers. Just him and a large, silent library of untouched books. The hospice visits became his new ritual. He read to dying strangers, washed dishes, drove patients to appointments. There was no glory in it. That was the point. For a man who had spent a lifetime building empires, learning how to sit beside someone without fixing them was its own kind of revolution. One day, after a reading at the hospice, Winston handed the patient a small book of poetry, her book. The man, too sick to focus, simply asked, "Did you write this?" Winston chuckled. "No," he said, "but I watched someone write it once, and I didn't understand it until years later." He left the book on the windowsill and walked out into the snow, feeling something he hadn't felt in decades, a kind of weightless grief, honest and earned. Back in Oregon, Grace received a package forwarded through her old publisher. It was a single book, the last quiet, worn, pages folded, margins scribbled with notes from various hands. Inside the cover was a small, faded card. No name, just a sentence. It reached him, after all. She closed the book, held it to her chest, and stood by the window in silence. There was no reunion, no dramatic meeting under falling snow, no apology whispered in the final hour. But there was something else, something more durable. An understanding, perhaps. Winston had finally stopped trying to be heard, and Grace no longer needed to explain. Their stories had intertwined like two currents in the same cold river, separate, but undeniably shaped by the other dot in a new workshop. Grace opened the class with a different tone. "Write something," she said, "for the person who made you silent. Then write something louder." The students didn't know why she smiled as she said it, but they wrote as if the world depended on it. And miles away, Winston returned home from the hospice and sat in front of his fireplace. The poem still hung above his desk. He didn't read it anymore. He didn't have to. It had done its work. It had taken a man carved from stone and reminded him he had once been flesh. Winston's handwriting had changed with age. What once was sharp and confident now shook slightly, a visible tremor tracing each letter. But the words he wrote were steadier than ever. In the silence of his Aspen study, he began a letter he knew would never be sent through traditional means. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. He no longer believed in the clean symmetry of apologies. It was something else, a ledger of moments he had buried too deep to admit until now. The letter was long, meandering through memories of boardrooms and empty dinners, of laughter he'd faked, of names he'd forgotten. But near the end, the tone shifted. "The worst mistake I made," he wrote, "was thinking the absence of pain meant the presence of peace. You reminded me that pain, when faced, can lead somewhere honest." He signed it only with his first name, folded it with care, and addressed it to the publisher of The Last Quiet. Weeks passed. The seasons shifted. In Oregon, Grace returned home one afternoon to find a plain manila envelope tucked into her mailbox. No return address. just the name of her editor scribbled on the front. She opened it slowly, knowing before she read the first line who had written it. Winston's voice was still in the rhythm of the words, less polished, more vulnerable. There were no metaphors, no eloquent reflections, just a man walking backward through the wreckage of himself, trying to name the things he never had the courage to feel. "I don't expect an answer," he concluded, "but today I understand that silence, when chosen, is a form of power, and I was too afraid to let you have yours." She read it once, then again, then folded it and placed it gently between the pages of her old blue notebook. Later that evening, she climbed into the attic, pulled down a box that hadn't been touched in years, and added his letter to the collection. She didn't cry. There was nothing left to mourn. The silence between them had transformed. It was no longer the void of broken trust, it was space, respected and necessary. Months later, the Aspen Hospice, where Winston volunteered, called the emergency contact listed on his file. A stroke had left him immobilized, partially lucid, but unable to speak. He was moved into long-term care. The man who once held meetings in skyscrapers now lay still in a quiet room, overlooking a pine-covered hill. The nurses didn't know his history, only that he rarely asked for anything, and spent most afternoons staring at the snow like it had something to tell him. A small bookshelf sat beside his bed. Among the titles was The Last Quiet, pages worn and bookmarked, corners folded with care. One morning, a nurse found an envelope beside the book. It was blank, sealed, resting gently on the cover. Inside was another letter shorter, written with effort. It was never mailed, never addressed, but the words were clear. "If I leave this world without a single monument, let it be known that once I met someone who saw me unarmed and didn't flinch." It was the last thing he ever wrote. Days later, he passed quietly. No obituary, no tribute. Just the sound of snow melting on glass and a nurse whispering a prayer. She wasn't sure he believed in. Grace heard about his death weeks later. A former editor sent her a clipped notice from a legal publication. Winston Merrick, former executive, dies at 74. No fanfare, no scandal, just a name and a date. She didn't speak of it to anyone. But that night, she returned to the attic, opened the old notebook, and reread his last letter. Then she wrote one of her own, not to him, but to herself, a poem, just a few lines. He left no echo, only space. But in that space, I built a voice, and it held. She didn't publish it. She folded it and placed it between the pages of The Last Quiet. Now weathered with time, the book no longer felt like hers. It had become something else, something past, something found. Years later, in a quiet neighborhood bookstore in the suburbs of Minneapolis, a young man browsing the clearance section picked up a used paperback with a cracked spine and a faint scent of cedar. The title, The Last Quiet, was embossed in silver. Half faded, no author's name on the cover, only a simple dedication on the first page, to the voice that arrived before the echo. Curious, he flipped through the pages and stopped at a dog-eared poem. He read it aloud under his breath. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but there was a weight in the lines. like something that had lived and broken and survived without needing to declare it. Something about it stayed with him. He didn't know why. He just knew he needed to take the book home. At the register, the clerk didn't comment. The book had sat on the shelf for months, untouched, unsold. Now it was leaving quietly. As it had arrived, the young man paid in cash, slipped the book into his backpack, and walked out into the overcast afternoon. As he walked to the bus stop, he reread the same poem. Something in it felt like a conversation he hadn't realized he was part of. He closed the book and sat with it resting on his knees, not quite ready to let go of the feeling it stirred. Miles away, Grace no longer taught in detention centers. She had transitioned into community work, mentoring young writers through grant programs and public libraries. Her name never appeared in announcements, and most students knew her simply as Miss G. Her hair had grayed slightly at the temples, and her eyes held the kind of calm that comes only after long storms. She kept her writing private. Now, scattered across notebooks, slips of paper, and the backs of receipts. Some of it she burned. Some she read once and stored in boxes that no one would ever open. But she wrote without urgency, without expectation. The world no longer owed her a voice, and that freedom made each word lighter. On Sundays, she walked the trail near the river, always alone, always with a small notebook in her coat pocket. She never used earbuds. She preferred the sound of leaves brushing each other, of water moving beneath stones. It reminded her of time, not the kind that chased people into anxiety, but the kind that allowed things to become real slowly. One Sunday, she sat on her usual bench, opened her notebook, and scribbled a single line. Some people are not meant to be followed, only remembered. Back in Aspen, the estate that once belonged to Winston Merrick was sold discreetly, stripped of its furnishings and repurposed as a writing retreat for artists recovering from trauma. No plaque bore his name, no mention of who had lived there before, but in the attic, now converted into a small reading room, someone had framed a yellowed poem and placed it on the wall. Beside the window, the paper had creases, faint ink smudges, and no signature. Guests often paused in front of it, reading in silence. Most never asked where it came from. They simply nodded, as if recognizing something not quite explainable. One spring morning, a woman with a faded blue scarf visited the retreat unannounced. She didn't stay long. She walked the halls slowly, paused briefly in the attic, and left, without introducing herself. Before leaving, she tucked a sealed envelope into the library's donation box. Inside was a folded note, handwritten, unsigned. Stories do not end, they rest. The staff kept the note. They didn't need to know who left it. And in some distant city, in the corner of a quiet apartment, a book sat on a table beside a lamp. Its pages worn, its spine cracked, its words still alive in the quiet afterthoughts of strangers. Some stories aren't remembered for their noise. They linger because they whisper something true into a world too often loud. And for those who listen, even once, the echo stays.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.